Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
I sat at the dinner table on March 15th watching my family celebrate while my 22nd birthday passed completely unnoticed. Mom had prepared Jake's favorite lasagna because he'd gotten accepted to law school that morning. Dad raised his glass of wine, beaming with pride as he toasted my younger brother's achievement. The golden light from our dining room chandelier seemed to spotlight Jake perfectly, while I remained invisible in the shadows. Then came the moment that shattered everything. Dad reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a velvet box containing a vintage Rolex watch, placing it directly in front of Jake. "This belonged to your grandfather," Dad announced proudly. "You've earned this." Not a single person remembered it was supposed to be my special day. 2 days had passed since I packed my Honda Civic and drove away from the suburban Beaverton house, where I'd spent 22 years being a ghost. Marcus opened his downtown Portland apartment door with genuine concern etched across his face, something my own family had never shown me. The cramped studio with exposed brick walls felt more welcoming than the 4-bedroom house I'd called home. "Dude, you can crash here as long as you need?" Marcus said, clearing comic books off his futon couch. "But seriously, what happened? You looked destroyed when you texted me." I dropped my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor and sank into the worn cushions. Everything I owned fit into 2 bags and a cardboard box. 22 years of existence reduced to so little that it barely filled Marcus's coffee table area. They forgot my birthday. I began, my voice cracking, despite my efforts to sound composed. But that's just the surface level. I've been thinking about everything, and I'm starting to see patterns I ignored before. Marcus grabbed 2 energy drinks from his mini fridge and settled into his desk chair, giving me his full attention. This was already more consideration than my family had offered in months. Jake got a brand new BMW for his 16th birthday. I continued, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Remember that Dad said it was because Jake had proven himself responsible. I was working 3 jobs at 19 just to buy my beat-up Honda, and they acted like that was normal. Like I should be grateful for the opportunity to struggle. "I always wondered about that," Marcus admitted quietly. "Your brother seemed to have everything handed to him while you were grinding constantly." The realization hit me like cold water. Even my friends had noticed the disparity, but I'd been too deep inside the situation to see it clearly. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos, Marcus leaning over to look at the screen. "Look at this," I said, stopping at a Christmas picture from 3 years ago. Everyone's gathered around Jake opening his laptop gift. I'm literally cropped out of the frame on the right side. You can barely see half my shoulder. Marcus pointed to another photo from my high school graduation. "And here Jake's standing between your parents while you're off to the side like an afterthought. Norton, this is messed up." I kept scrolling, finding pattern after pattern. Jake's law school acceptance announcement had 64 likes on Mom's Facebook page. My promotion to assistant manager at Circuit Central last month hadn't even been mentioned. Jake's achievements covered the refrigerator like wallpaper, while my Employee of the Month certificates had been quietly removed to make room. "There's more," I said, opening my laptop and logging into my old Gmail account. I was cleaning out my email yesterday and found something that doesn't make sense. Marcus moved his chair closer as I navigated to a folder labeled college stuff that I hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside was a PDF attachment I'd completely forgotten about. "What? Stanford University?" Marcus read over my shoulder. "Norton Williams, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected for our Academic Excellence Scholarship Program." The room went completely silent. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly as I clicked open the full document. The scholarship offer was dated March 20th, 3 years ago, just 5 days after my 19th birthday. It covered 40% of tuition costs and included priority course registration. "I never saw this email," I whispered. "I remember applying to Stanford on a whim, But when I asked my parents about hearing back from colleges, they said I wasn't college material. Dad told me I should focus on learning a trade instead. Marcus grabbed my shoulder. Norton, check the email thread, see if there are any replies. I scrolled down and found what made my stomach drop completely. There was a response sent from my account 3 days after the scholarship offer arrived. The message politely declined the scholarship, stating that I had decided to pursue vocational training instead and would not be attending college. I never wrote this, I said, my voice barely audible. I never even saw the original email. Someone else responded using my account. The betrayal cut deeper than simple neglect. This was active sabotage of my future, deliberate manipulation, disguised as parental guidance. While Jake was being groomed for success, I was being systematically pushed toward limitation. Marcus stood up and paced across his small living space. We need to figure out who had access to your email account 3 years ago. My parents, I replied immediately. They set up all my accounts in high school and insisted on keeping the passwords for safety reasons. I was too trusting to question it. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Every time I'd expressed interest in higher education, I was redirected toward immediate employment. Every academic achievement was downplayed, while Jake's mediocre grades were celebrated as exceptional. I'd been conditioned to believe I was the less capable brother when the evidence suggested the opposite. There's something else, I said, opening another email folder. I just remembered getting rejected for financial aid when I finally tried applying for community college last year. They said my credit score was too low, but I'd never had a credit card. Marcus sat back down, his expression growing more serious. Norton, you need to pull your credit report immediately. Something's really wrong here. As I logged into the free credit monitoring website, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mom. Honey, Marcus texted us your address. I have some of your old things in a box. I'll drop them off tomorrow afternoon while you're at work. She's already planning to come here without asking permission, I told Marcus, showing him the message. And how does she know my work schedule? Because she's been tracking your life while pretending not to care, Marcus replied grimly. This is way more calculated than I thought. The credit report loaded on my laptop screen, and what I saw there confirmed my worst fears. There was indeed a credit card account in my name opened 3 years ago, with a current balance of $8,400. The payment history showed multiple late payments and 2 missed payments, destroying my credit score. I never applied for this card, I said, pointing at the screen. Look at the billing address. It's my parents' house, but I was never living there when this was opened. I was renting that studio apartment on Division Street during my gap year. Marcus leaned forward to read the details more carefully. The initial charges are all at stores near your parents' house. Best Buy, Target, Nordstrom. These look like purchases for college preparation. Jake's college preparation. I corrected the full picture, becoming horrifically clear. They used my identity to fund Jake's lifestyle while destroying my financial future. That's why I couldn't get student loans or financial aid. I already looked like a credit risk who couldn't manage basic payments. The manipulation ran far deeper than favoritism. This was financial fraud committed by the people who were supposed to protect and support me. They had systematically stolen my opportunities while positioning themselves as loving parents who simply recognized their children's different strengths. Marcus grabbed a notebook and started writing. We need to document everything. The forged email response, the unauthorized credit card, the scholarship you never knew about. This isn't just family drama anymore, Norton. This is serious legal stuff. I felt a strange mix of validation and devastation. Finally understanding that I wasn't crazy or overly sensitive provided relief, but the depth of the betrayal was overwhelming. 22 years of believing I was the problem, the disappointment, the less worthy son, when the reality was completely different. There's one more thing I want to check, I said, navigating back to my email and searching for any correspondence from other colleges. If they intercepted Stanford's email, maybe there were others. Sure enough, buried in my spam folder were automated rejection notices from colleges I'd never actually applied to, but also acceptance letters from Oregon State University and Portland State University that I'd never seen before. Someone had been managing my entire college application process, without my knowledge accepting some applications and declining others based on criteria I wasn't part of. They were controlling your entire future, Marcus said quietly, making decisions about your life while pretending to let you choose your own path. As the evening wore on, we compiled a list of evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic manipulation and financial fraud. I wasn't the family failure I'd been raised to believe I was. I was the victim of deliberate sabotage by people who should have been my greatest supporters. That night, lying on Marcus's futon and staring at the ceiling, I realized that leaving home wasn't running away from my problems. It was the first step toward discovering who I actually was beneath years of imposed limitations. The brother they'd convinced me I was didn't exist. The real Norton was buried under decades of systematic diminishment, and it was time to dig him out. The next morning, I found myself sitting across from Sarah Thompson, a guidance counselor at Portland Community College, in her cramped office, decorated with motivational posters and towers of college brochures. Marcus had insisted I talk to someone official about my situation, someone who understood how educational systems worked. "Let me get this straight," Sarah said, reviewing the printed emails I'd brought with me. "You received a scholarship offer from Stanford 3 years ago, never saw it, and someone replied from your account, declining the offer." "That's correct," I replied, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I found the whole email chain yesterday when I was going through old files. I had no idea any of this existed." Sarah adjusted her reading glasses and examined the Stanford correspondence more closely. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she read through the timeline of events. "Norton, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I want you to answer honestly. Did you give anyone permission to access your email account or respond to college communications on your behalf?" "No," I said firmly. "My parents set up my accounts in high school, but I never authorized them to make decisions about my education. They told me I wasn't hearing back from colleges because I wasn't qualified." Sarah picked up her desk phone and dialed a number. "I'm calling my contact at Stanford's admissions office. This situation raises some serious red flags, and I want to get their perspective on what happened." While she spoke quietly with someone at Stanford, I looked around her office and noticed several success stories pinned to a bulletin board. Students who'd transferred to four-year universities, scholarship recipients, career changers, who'd found their passion later in life. For the first time in years, I wondered what my story might have been if I'd had proper guidance. "Okay," Sarah said, hanging up the phone with a grim expression. "I spoke with Janet Morrison in Stanford's admissions office. She remembers your application because your SAT scores were in their top 15% of applicants that year. She also confirmed that someone did respond from your email address, declining the scholarship." The room seemed to spin slightly. My SAT scores were in Stanford's top 15%. My parents had told me I'd barely scored well enough for community college, and that Jake's scores were significantly higher. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Janet pulled your file, and according to their records, your cumulative GPA was 3.87, and your essay about overcoming family challenges was noted as particularly compelling by the admissions committee." I stared at Sarah in disbelief. My parents told me my grades weren't good enough for competitive colleges. They said Jake was the academic one and I should focus on learning practical skills. "Norton, your academic record suggests exactly the opposite. You were college material, probably exceptional college material. Someone deliberately misled you about your capabilities." Sarah opened her laptop and began typing rapidly. "I'm going to help you run a credit check right now, and then we're going to call several colleges to see if there are other applications or acceptances you might not know about. This pattern of deception might be more extensive than you realize. The credit report appeared on her screen, and Sarah's face darkened as she scrolled through the details. There are multiple accounts in your name that show activity during periods when you say you were unaware of having credit. This credit card here shows charges at college bookstores and dormitory supply companies. Those would be Jake's expenses. I said, pieces clicking together. He started college 3 years ago, right around the time this card was opened. Sarah printed the credit report and highlighted several suspicious transactions. Norton, this appears to be identity theft. The charges correspond with typical college preparation purchases, but they were made using your social security number and credit profile. She handed me a business card for a legal aid organization. You need to speak with someone who specializes in family financial fraud. This goes way beyond educational counseling. Is there anything I can do about the Stanford scholarship now? I asked, though I suspected the answer. That particular opportunity has passed, Sarah replied gently. But your academic potential hasn't diminished. Let me show you some current options that might work for someone in your situation. Sarah pulled out a thick folder filled with transfer program information, scholarship opportunities, and application deadlines for spring enrollment. Portland State has an excellent transfer program for students with gaps in their educational timeline. Oregon State offers need-based aid for students who can demonstrate financial independence from their families. I'm working full-time at Circuit Central, I said. I couldn't afford to quit for school. Actually, there are evening and weekend programs specifically designed for working adults. And given your academic record, you'd likely qualify for multiple forms of financial assistance. Sarah walked me through several realistic pathways back to higher education, each one feeling like a door opening after years of being told all the doors were locked. She helped me fill out preliminary applications for 3 different programs, all of which had rolling admissions for the summer and fall semesters. There's something else I want to investigate, Sarah said, picking up her phone again. I'm calling the financial aid office to see why your applications were rejected last year. After a brief conversation, Sarah hung up with a puzzled expression. According to their records, you never actually completed a financial aid application. The system shows that you started the process, but never submitted the required documents. That's impossible, I protested. I remember filling out all the paperwork and submitting everything online. Sarah turned her computer screen toward me. Look at this. The application shows as initiated, but never submitted. It's like someone started the process, but deliberately stopped before completion. The pattern of sabotage was becoming undeniable. Someone had systematically blocked every path I'd tried to take toward educational advancement, creating the illusion that I was being rejected, when in reality, I was being prevented from even applying properly. Sarah, can I ask you something honestly? I said, my voice shaking slightly. Based on my academic record and test scores, do you think I could have succeeded at a competitive university? She looked me directly in the eyes. Norton, based on what I'm seeing here, you should have been actively recruited by several excellent universities. Your profile suggests you were exactly the kind of student that competitive programs look for high academic achievement despite challenging circumstances. The validation was overwhelming. For 22 years, I'd accepted that I was intellectually inferior to Jake, that my role in the family was to be the practical one who worked while others studied. Learning that this narrative was fabricated felt like discovering I'd been living someone else's life. I want to move forward, I said decisively. Whatever it takes to get back on track educationally. I don't want to waste any more time believing lies about my capabilities. Sarah smiled, the first genuinely encouraging expression I'd received about my future in years. Excellent. Let's start with Portland State's evening program. They have a fast-track application process for students with strong academic backgrounds who need flexible scheduling. As I filled out the application paperwork, Sarah made several more phone calls on my behalf. By the end of our 2-hour meeting, I had preliminary acceptance into Portland State's evening business program applications, submitted for 3 different scholarship opportunities and appointments scheduled with both a financial aid counselor and a legal aid attorney. Walking out of Sarah's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since high school: genuine excitement about learning and growing intellectually. The future that had been systematically hidden from me was finally becoming visible again. But first, I needed to confront the people who had stolen it from me in the first place. That afternoon, I drove back to Marcus's apartment with a folder full of evidence and a growing sense of righteous anger. The timid, apologetic Norton, who had left home 3 days ago, was evolving into someone who refused to accept lies and manipulation as normal family dynamics. Marcus was waiting with a pizza and more bad news. "Your mom stopped by while you were gone," he said grimly. "She left that box of your stuff, but Norton, there's something seriously weird about what she brought." The cardboard box sat on Marcus's kitchen counter, innocuously labeled Norton's room in Mom's careful handwriting. Inside, I found childhood trophies, old school projects, and a manila envelope I'd never seen before. The envelope contained my original college application essays, printed copies of my high school transcripts, and scholarship applications I'd never submitted. Someone had been collecting documentation of my academic potential while simultaneously preventing me from pursuing it. "It's like they wanted to preserve evidence of what I could have been," I said, holding my unsubmitted application to Reed College. "But why keep this stuff if they were trying to hold me back?" Marcus examined the documents more carefully. "Look at the dates on these essays. Some of them are from after you supposedly decided not to pursue college. Someone was continuing to prepare your academic materials even while telling you education wasn't your path." The psychological manipulation was becoming clearer. My parents had maintained the paperwork necessary to apply for competitive programs, while convincing me I wasn't qualified for those opportunities. They'd preserved evidence of my potential while systematically destroying my access to it. At the bottom of the box, underneath old yearbooks and participation certificates, I found a bank statement with my name on it from 3 years ago. The account showed regular deposits labeled educational savings, totaling $12,000. I never had a savings account, I told Marcus, staring at the statement. "And look at these deposit dates. They correspond exactly with the periods when I was working overtime at my first job." Marcus compared the dates with the credit card statements we'd printed earlier. "Norton, I think they were taking money from your paychecks for this educational savings, while simultaneously using your credit for Jake's expenses. They were funding Jake's education with your money while destroying your credit." The scope of the financial manipulation was staggering. Not only had they prevented me from pursuing higher education, they'd used my own earnings to fund Jake's opportunities while creating debt in my name that would prevent me from accessing financial aid. My phone rang, interrupting our analysis. The caller ID showed Dad's number, and I hesitated before answering. "Norton." Dad's voice sounded strained and unfamiliar. "We need to talk. Can you come home? Your mother's very upset and Jake's having trouble focusing on his studies." "I'm not coming home," I replied calmly. "But I do want to talk. I've discovered some interesting things about my college applications and my credit report." There was a long pause before Dad responded. "I don't know what you think you found, but you're misunderstanding the situation. Everything we did was to help you find your proper path in life." "My proper path?" I repeated. "You mean the path where I work minimum wage jobs while Jake gets opportunities funded by credit cards opened in my name?" Another pause, longer this time. "Norton, you're being dramatic. Come home and we'll explain everything." "No," I said firmly. "If you want to explain anything, you can meet me at a neutral location with all the documentation about my finances and educational history. And Dad, I'm bringing a lawyer." I ended the call before he could respond, my hands trembling slightly but my resolve strengthening. The conversation had confirmed what I already suspected: they knew exactly what they'd done, and they still believed they could manipulate me into accepting their version of events. That, Marcus said with obvious admiration, was the most backbone I've ever heard you show with your family. I'm done being the victim, I replied, looking at the evidence spread across his kitchen table. They stole my identity, my opportunities, and my self-worth. Now, I'm taking all of it back. The transformation was already beginning. Instead of the confused, apologetic young man who had fled home in shame, I was becoming someone who demanded answers and refused to accept gaslighting as normal communication. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life. But tonight, for the first time in 22 years, I felt genuinely proud of the person I was becoming. A week had passed since my conversation with Sarah Thompson, and I'd spent that time gathering documentation and building my confidence. The legal aid attorney had confirmed that I was a victim of identity theft and financial fraud committed by people who had legal authority over my accounts when I was a minor, but who had continued the abuse into my adulthood. Now I stood on the front porch of my childhood home in Beaverton, holding a folder of evidence and feeling my heart race with nervous energy. Through the living room window, I could see my extended family gathered for what appeared to be another celebration of Jake's law school acceptance. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, a small but significant assertion of my changed status. Mom opened the door with a surprised expression, as if she hadn't been expecting me despite my phone call earlier requesting this meeting. "Norton, honey, come in," she said, her voice carrying forced cheerfulness. "Everyone's here for Jake's celebration dinner. Uncle David drove down from Seattle and Grandma Betty made her famous apple pie." I stepped inside and immediately noticed the decorations. Balloons reading "Congratulations, Graduate" filled the living room, even though Jake wouldn't graduate for another 3 years. A banner hung across the mantel reading "Future Attorney Jake Williams." And the dining table was set with Mom's best china. "This is quite a production for someone who just got accepted to school," I observed, setting my folder on the hall table. "Well, law school is a big achievement," Mom replied defensively. "We're proud of Jake's hard work." I followed her into the living room where Jake sat, surrounded by relatives opening congratulatory cards and gifts. Uncle David looked up as I entered, his expression brightening with genuine warmth. "Norton, great to see you, nephew. How's the job at Circuit Central treating you?" "Actually, Uncle David, I've been learning some interesting things about my career prospects," I replied louder than necessary. The room's conversation quieted as relatives turned their attention toward me. Dad appeared from the kitchen, carrying a bottle of champagne. "Norton, glad you could make it. We were just toasting Jake's bright future." Speaking of bright futures, I said, retrieving my folder and opening it deliberately. I wanted to share some discoveries I've made about my own educational opportunities. The room fell completely silent except for the soft jazz music playing from the stereo. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. "I found out that I was accepted to Stanford University 3 years ago," I announced, holding up the printed email. Full disclosure, I never saw this acceptance letter because someone responded from my email account declining the scholarship. Uncle David set down his wine glass and moved closer. "That doesn't make sense, Norton. If you were accepted to Stanford, why wouldn't you have gone?" "Excellent question," I replied, appreciating his direct approach. "It turns out I was also accepted to Oregon State and Portland State, but I never saw those letters either. In fact, I've discovered a pattern of intercepted college correspondence that prevented me from pursuing higher education." Aunt Linda, Dad's sister, looked confused. "But Norton, your parents told us you weren't interested in college. They said you preferred learning practical skills." Another interesting point. I continued pulling out my high school transcripts. My GPA was 3.87, and my SAT scores were in Stanford's top 15% of applicants. Does that sound like someone who wasn't college material? The room's atmosphere changed dramatically. Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, and I noticed Grandma Betty watching Mom and Dad with a sharp, assessing expression. Mom stepped forward, her voice becoming defensive. Norton, you're taking things out of context. We were trying to guide you toward a realistic path. Not everyone is meant for expensive universities. Realistic, I repeated, pulling out the credit card statements. Let's talk about realistic. Here's a credit card that was opened in my name 3 years ago, maxed out at $8,400 with purchases at college bookstores and dormitory supply stores. Uncle David took the statements and examined them closely. These charges are all dated during Jake's freshman year of college, he observed, his voice growing serious. Exactly, I said. While I was being told I wasn't college material, someone was using my identity to finance Jake's education and destroying my credit in the process. Jake finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Norton, I didn't know about the credit card thing. Well, but you did know about Stanford? I replied, looking directly at him. Didn't you, Jake? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Jake nodded slowly. I knew Mom and Dad had gotten some letters for you, but they said you weren't interested in going that far from home. They said, I repeated. Jake, did you ever ask me directly what I wanted? Jake's face flushed red, and he stared down at his hands. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room. Uncle David set the credit card statements on the coffee table with deliberate force. This is identity theft, he said bluntly. Norton, did you authorize these charges? I never even knew the credit card existed until this week, I replied. I couldn't get financial aid for community college because my credit score was destroyed by late payments on debt I never created. Grandma Betty, who had been quietly observing, suddenly stood up with surprising energy for her 83 years. Wait just 1 minute, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 6 children. Are you telling us that you've been working full-time jobs while Jake's education was being paid for with credit cards opened in your name? That appears to be the situation, I confirmed. Grandma Betty turned to face my parents with an expression I'd never seen before. Robert and Carol Williams, I am ashamed of both of you. This is not how we raised our children to treat family. Dad stepped forward defensively. Mother, you don't understand the full situation. We were trying to help both boys find their appropriate paths in life. Appropriate paths, Uncle David repeated incredulously. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through old text messages. I have something that might interest everyone here. The room waited as Uncle David found what he was looking for. 2 years ago, I offered to pay for Norton's college education. I texted your father about contributing $20,000 toward tuition costs. He held up his phone, showing the message thread. Robert's response was that Norton wasn't interested in higher education and preferred working with his hands. He said Norton had specifically declined college opportunities to focus on developing practical skills. I stared at Uncle David in shock. You offered to pay for my college? $20,000, Uncle David confirmed. I've been successful in my architecture firm and I wanted to help my nephew pursue his dreams. Your father told me you'd explicitly chosen a different path. The betrayal cut even deeper than the forged emails and fraudulent credit accounts. My parents hadn't just stolen opportunities I didn't know about. They'd actively rejected help from family members who wanted to support my education. Aunt Linda pulled out her own phone. I just remembered something, she said, scrolling through old emails. Last year, I sent information about scholarship programs for working students to Carol. I specifically asked her to pass it along to Norton because I thought he might be interested. She found the email chain and read aloud. Carol's response says, thanks for thinking of Norton, but he's really happy with his current situation and isn't looking to make any changes. I never saw that information, I said quietly. In fact, I was desperately trying to find ways to afford school last year. The evidence was overwhelming, and the room's energy had shifted completely. Instead of celebrating Jake's achievement, my extended family was discovering systematic deception that had affected multiple people's decisions and relationships. Uncle David stood up and addressed my parents directly. Robert Carroll, I need you to explain why you've been lying to the entire family about Norton's educational interests and intercepting opportunities meant for him. Dad's defensive posture crumbled slightly. We weren't lying. We were making parental decisions based on what we thought was best for both boys. Norton is more practical-minded, and Jake is more academically inclined. Based on what evidence? Uncle David demanded. Norton's academic record suggests exactly the opposite. Mom finally spoke, her voice shaking with emotion. Jake needed more support. He's always struggled with confidence, and Norton seemed more self-sufficient. We thought Norton would be fine working while Jake focused on his studies. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. They had consciously chosen to sacrifice my opportunities to boost Jake's confidence, treating my potential as expendable in service of his emotional needs. So you committed fraud, Grandma Betty said bluntly. You stole from one grandson to benefit the other, and you lied to the whole family about it. Jake stood up abruptly, his face pale and his hands shaking. Norton, I'm sorry. I didn't know how bad it was. I thought you really didn't want to go to college. Because that's what they told you. I replied, feeling sorry for Jake despite everything. They manipulated both of us just in different ways. Uncle David gathered the evidence I'd brought and examined each document carefully. Norton, this isn't just family drama. This is serious legal stuff. Have you consulted with an attorney? I confirmed. The legal aid office confirmed that identity theft occurred, and they're helping me file disputes with the credit reporting agencies. Good, Uncle David said firmly. And I want you to know that my offer to help with your education still stands. In fact, given what I've learned today, I'd like to increase it. The conversation continued for another hour, with various family members expressing shock, disappointment, and support. By the end, it was clear that my parents had lost significant credibility with the extended family, while I had gained allies I didn't know I had. As I prepared to leave, Jake approached me privately. Norton, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that I never asked them to do any of this. I would have been fine with you going to college, too. I know, I replied. Jake, you're not the villain here, but you are going to have to start taking responsibility for your own life. These scholarships and opportunities need to be earned, not stolen. Jake nodded solemnly. I'm going to talk to them about making this right somehow. Don't talk to them, I advised. Talk to a lawyer. Because if they've done this to me, there's no guarantee they won't do something similar to you when it's convenient. As I drove away from the house, I felt a complex mix of emotions. The confrontation had been painful but necessary, and it had revealed support from family members I'd never expected. More importantly, it had forced my parents to acknowledge their deception in front of witnesses who could no longer pretend not to see the pattern of manipulation. The scared, apologetic Norton, who had slunk away a week ago, was gone. In his place was someone who demanded honesty and refused to accept lies as love. The real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning, but for the first time I had both evidence and allies. Tomorrow I would begin the legal process of reclaiming my identity. Tonight I would celebrate the fact that I'd finally found my voice. Uncle David called me the next morning while I was getting ready for my shift at Circuit Central. His voice carried an energy and determination that reminded me why he'd been successful in business. Norton, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I want to make you an offer, and I need you to consider it seriously. I sat down on Marcus's futon, still holding my work uniform. What kind of offer? Move to Seattle, come work for my architecture firm as a junior draftsman. I'll provide housing, a competitive salary, and support for your education. You have natural ability that's being wasted in retail. The offer caught me completely off guard. Uncle David, I appreciate the thought, but I don't have any experience in architecture. Experience can be taught, he replied firmly. What can't be taught is intelligence, work ethic, and the ability to think spatially. Based on your academic record, and what I've observed about your problem-solving skills, I believe you'd excel in this field. I looked around Marcus's cramped studio apartment, then thought about my job at Circuit Central, where I'd been helping customers understand technical specifications for electronics. The work came naturally to me, especially the aspects that required explaining complex systems in simple terms. What would the position actually involve? I asked curiosity, overcoming my initial hesitation. Initially, you'd be working with our CAD software, learning to create technical drawings from architectural plans. My senior draftsman, Jennifer Walsh, would be your supervisor. She's excellent at training people who have the right foundation. Uncle David outlined a comprehensive plan that included evening classes at the University of Washington, gradual increases in responsibility at the firm, and housing in a studio apartment above his office building. The opportunity represented everything I'd been systematically denied: education, career advancement, and mentorship from someone who believed in my potential. I need to give Circuit Central 2 weeks' notice, I said, making the decision as I spoke. And I want to finish the legal process here regarding the identity theft? Absolutely, Uncle David agreed. Handle your business properly in Portland, then come up when you're ready, Norton. I'm excited about this. I think you're going to surprise yourself with what you can accomplish. After ending the call, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the change. In 1 week, I'd gone from believing I was a retail worker with limited prospects to discovering I was an identity theft victim with academic potential and family support I'd never known existed. Marcus emerged from his bathroom, dressed for his job at the graphic design studio. That sounded like good news, he observed. Uncle David offered me a job in Seattle. Architecture firm, education support, housing included. Dude, that's incredible. Marcus said, genuine excitement in his voice. Are you going to take it? I think I am, I replied, still feeling slightly stunned. It's scary, but it's also the first opportunity anyone's offered me based on my actual potential rather than their assumptions about my limitations. That afternoon at Circuit Central, I found myself looking at my workplace with new eyes. I'd been competent at retail sales, but I'd never felt passionate about it. The job had been survival, not fulfillment. For the first time, I could envision work that might actually engage my interests and abilities. My manager, Derek, was understanding about my resignation and offered to provide a strong reference. Norton, you've been one of our most reliable employees, he said. Customers trust your technical explanations and you're great at solving complex problems. You'll do well wherever you're headed. The validation felt meaningful because it came from someone who'd observed my work daily, without the emotional complications of family dynamics. Derek's assessment suggested that my capabilities weren't just academic abstractions. They translated into real-world competence that others recognized and valued. That evening, I met with Michelle Chang, the legal aid attorney who was handling my identity theft case. Her office was small, but organized with law books, covering every wall, and client files stacked neatly on her desk. I've reviewed all the documentation you provided, Michelle said, spreading my case file across her desk. The evidence is overwhelming. Your parents clearly committed identity theft, mail fraud, and financial fraud. The question is how you want to proceed. She outlined several legal options ranging from formal criminal charges to civil recovery of damages. The criminal route would likely result in prosecution, but might strain family relationships permanently. The civil approach focused on financial restitution and credit repair, but required my parents to acknowledge wrongdoing and cooperate with the process. What would you recommend? I asked. Honestly, given the extensive nature of the fraud and the fact that it prevented you from accessing educational opportunities, I think you should pursue criminal charges. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a systematic pattern of theft that continued over several years. Michelle explained that the credit card debt in my name would be removed once the fraud was officially documented, and that I could potentially recover damages for the educational opportunities I'd lost. The legal process would take months, but the outcome would clear my record and establish consequences for my parents' actions. There's another consideration, Michelle added. If your parents used your identity for this credit card, There might be other accounts or financial activities you're not aware of. We should run a comprehensive background check to make sure we found everything. The thought that there might be additional fraud I hadn't discovered yet was unsettling, but Michelle was right about the need for thoroughness. If I was going to reclaim my identity, I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done in my name. Over the next week, I worked my final shifts at Circuit Central, while Michelle's investigation uncovered the complete picture of my parents' financial manipulation. The results were worse than I'd initially understood. In addition to the credit card I'd found, there were 2 student loans in my name totaling $37,000, both of which had been used to fund Jake's education. There was also a checking account that had been opened and closed multiple times, apparently used to launder money between various family financial obligations. Most disturbing was the discovery that my parents had listed me as a dependent on their tax returns for the past 4 years, claiming credits and deductions based on my supposed financial dependence while I was actually supporting myself through full-time employment. This is extensive financial fraud, Michelle explained during our final meeting before I moved to Seattle. Your parents essentially created a parallel financial identity for you that they controlled and manipulated for their benefit. The legal process would continue even after I relocated, but Michelle was confident that the evidence was strong enough to secure both criminal prosecution and full financial restitution. My credit score would be restored, the fraudulent debts would be eliminated, and my parents would face legal consequences for their actions. On my last night in Portland, Marcus threw a small going-away party with several friends from high school and work. As I looked around the room at people who genuinely wished me well, I realized this was what supportive relationships actually looked like, people celebrating my success rather than undermining it. "You know what's crazy?" Marcus said as we cleaned up afterward. "A month ago, you thought your family was just quirky, and you were the problem. Now you're moving to Seattle to start an architecture career with a full scholarship. It's like you discovered you were living someone else's life." "That's exactly what it feels like," I agreed. For 22 years, I accepted their version of who I was. Finding out the truth has been painful, but it's also been incredibly liberating. That night, packing my belongings into the same 2 bags and cardboard box I'd brought to Marcus's place, I reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The scared, confused young man who'd fled home believing he was a disappointment had transformed into someone with clear goals, legal representation, and family support. The drive to Seattle the next morning felt like traveling toward a completely different life. I was no longer Norton, the retail worker who'd failed to launch. I was Norton, the architecture student with academic potential and career prospects. The change wasn't just external. It was a fundamental shift in how I understood my own capabilities and worth. Uncle David met me at his office, building a converted warehouse in Capitol Hill, with large windows and exposed brick walls. The space felt creative and purposeful, filled with architectural models, drafting tables, and technical drawings that represented real projects changing real communities. "Welcome to your new life," Uncle David said, showing me the studio apartment above the office. "It's small, but it's yours, and it's rent-free while you're getting established." The apartment was compact but thoughtfully designed with built-in furniture and large windows overlooking the city. After months of sleeping on Marcus's futon, having my own space felt like luxury. That afternoon, Uncle David introduced me to Jennifer Walsh, my new supervisor. She was in her early 30s with an infectious enthusiasm for architectural design and a talent for explaining complex concepts in accessible terms. "I've reviewed your academic records," Jennifer said, examining the transcripts I'd brought. "Your math and spatial reasoning skills are exactly what we need for technical drafting. I think you're going to enjoy this work." She showed me the CAD workstation, where I'd be learning to create architectural drawings, the reference library filled with building codes and design specifications, and the project room where the team collaborated on current developments. "Yes, we're working on a mixed-use development in Belltown. Jennifer explained, pointing to architectural models and site plans. It combines residential units with retail space and public areas. You'll be helping create the technical drawings that translate our design concepts into buildable reality. For the first time in my life, I was looking at work that seemed intellectually challenging and creatively satisfying. Instead of selling other people's products, I would be creating solutions to complex spatial and technical problems. That evening, I called Marcus to let him know I'd arrived safely. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like I'm finally living my own life instead of the life someone else designed for me," I replied, looking out my new windows at the Seattle skyline. "It's terrifying and exciting at the same time." 2 weeks later, Dad called for the first time since I'd left Portland. His voice sounded strained and unfamiliar, lacking the confident authority I'd always associated with him. "Norton, we need to talk. Your mother's having a hard time and Jake's struggling with his studies. Can you come home?" "I'm not coming home," I replied calmly, "but I'm willing to listen." "This whole situation has gotten out of hand. We think you're misunderstanding what happened. Everything we did was trying to help both you boys find your proper places in life." "Dad, I'm working with attorneys who specialize in identity theft. There's no misunderstanding. You committed federal crimes using my personal information." There was a long pause before Dad continued, his voice becoming more desperate. "Norton, please, come home and let's work this out as a family. Jake needs his big brother right now." "Jake needs to learn to solve his own problems," I replied. "And you need to face the legal consequences of your choices." "Legal consequences." Dad's voice cracked slightly. "Norton, we're your parents. We love you. This doesn't need to involve lawyers and courts." "Actually, it does," I said firmly. "Love doesn't excuse fraud. Love doesn't justify stealing someone's future. Love certainly doesn't mean I have to pretend this didn't happen." After I ended the call, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The conversation confirmed that my parents still didn't understand the magnitude of what they'd done, but it also proved that I'd developed the strength to maintain appropriate boundaries despite their emotional manipulation. I was no longer the Norton who absorbed blame and accepted limitation as normal. I was becoming someone who demanded honesty, pursued opportunity, and refused to sacrifice my potential for other people's comfort. The transformation was just beginning, but the foundation was solid. For the first time in my life, I was building a future based on my actual capabilities rather than other people's limitations. 3 weeks into my new life in Seattle, I was settling into a routine that felt both challenging and rewarding. My mornings started with CAD training under Jennifer's patient guidance. My afternoons involved working on real architectural projects, and my evenings were spent in University of Washington continuing education courses. The work came naturally to me in a way that retail never had. Creating technical drawings required precision spatial reasoning and attention to detail skills I'd apparently always possessed, but had never had the opportunity to develop. Jennifer frequently complimented my progress, noting that I seemed to intuitively understand the relationship between design concepts and buildable reality. "You have an engineer's mind with an artist's eye," she told me during one of our weekly review sessions. That combination is rare and valuable in architecture. The validation felt genuine because it was based on observable performance rather than family politics. For the first time, I was receiving feedback about my actual abilities from people with no investment in maintaining family dynamics or protecting anyone's feelings. That Thursday evening, I was working late on a technical drawing for the Belltown project when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my cousin Tyler's number, which was unusual since we'd never been particularly close. "Norton, I need to tell you something," Tyler said without preamble. "It's about your parents and money stuff. I think you should know what's been happening." I saved my work and gave Tyler my full attention. "What kind of money stuff?" "My mom got a call from your mom last week asking to borrow $5,000. She said it was for medical bills from when you were sick a few years ago." My stomach dropped. "Tyler, I was never seriously sick. What medical bills?" "That's what I thought was weird," Tyler continued. Mom asked me if I remembered you having any health problems, and I couldn't think of anything. But your mom was really specific about the details. She said you'd had some kind of infection that required expensive treatment, and your family was still paying off the medical debt. The conversation revealed another layer of deception I hadn't anticipated. My parents had been using my supposed medical problems as a justification for borrowing money from extended family members, creating fictional debts to explain their financial difficulties. Tyler, how many relatives has my mom asked for money? I don't know for sure, but Mom mentioned that Aunt Linda had gotten a similar call last month. And I think your Grandma Betty might have given them money too, because she asked my dad if you were okay health-wise. The scope of the financial manipulation was expanding beyond identity theft into systematic fraud targeting my entire extended family. My parents had apparently been using fabricated stories about my health and financial needs to extract money from relatives who genuinely wanted to help. There's something else, Tyler added. My dad did some research on property records because he was thinking about lending your parents money for their mortgage. Norton, they refinanced their house twice in the past 3 years. Each time they took out more money than the house was worth. I grabbed a notepad and started taking detailed notes. How much money are we talking about? The first refinance was for $80,000 above the home's value. The second one was for another $60,000. Your dad told my dad they were using the money for home improvements and educational investments. Educational investments. The phrase made my skin crawl because I now understood exactly whose education had been invested in and whose credit had been destroyed to make it possible. Tyler, I need you to help me contact everyone who might have lent money to my parents. I think we're dealing with a much bigger fraud situation than I initially realized. Over the next few days, Tyler and I systematically contacted extended family members to understand the full scope of my parents' financial deception. The results were staggering and heartbreaking. Grandma Betty had given them $12,000 over 18 months, believing she was helping with my medical expenses. Aunt Linda had contributed $8,000 for what she thought were my college costs. Uncle David's brother, Mark, had lent them $15,000 for Norton's emergency surgery that never happened. In total, my parents had borrowed nearly $50,000 from family members, using fabricated stories about my health education and financial needs. None of the relatives had spoken to me directly to verify the stories, because my parents claimed I was embarrassed about needing help. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Not only had they stolen my identity and opportunities, they damaged my relationships with extended family by making me appear to be a financial burden who was too proud to acknowledge help. Michelle Chang was amazed when I called to update her on these discoveries. Norton, this transforms your case completely. We're no longer dealing with simple identity theft. This is wire fraud, mail fraud, and potentially RICO violations if we can establish a pattern of ongoing criminal enterprise. She explained that using false pretenses to obtain money from multiple victims across state lines elevated the case to federal jurisdiction. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division would likely be interested in investigating the full scope of my parents' activities. The good news is that this strengthens your position enormously, Michelle continued. With this many victims and this much documentation, there's no question about criminal intent or the systematic nature of the fraud. That weekend, Uncle David drove up from Portland to meet with me in person. His expression was grim as he reviewed the documentation I'd compiled about my parents' borrowing activities. Norton, I'm ashamed that I didn't investigate more thoroughly when your father told me you weren't interested in college. The signs were there, but I trusted my brother to be honest about his children's interests. You had no reason to suspect this level of deception, I replied. They've been running this con for years, and they were careful to prevent anyone from comparing stories. Uncle David pulled out a manila folder containing legal documents. I've been doing some research of my own, and I found something else you need to know about. He handed me a stack of papers that appeared to be loan documents. These are the papers for Jake's law school tuition. Norton, you're listed as a co-signer on $60,000 in educational loans. I stared at the documents in disbelief. My signature appeared on multiple pages, but I had never seen these papers before and certainly had never signed them. This is a forgery, I said, examining the signature more closely. It's close to my handwriting, but look at the way the N is formed. I never make the initial stroke that way. Uncle David nodded grimly. I suspected as much. But Norton, this means you're legally responsible for Jake's law school debt unless we can prove the signatures were forged. The financial liability was enormous. $60,000 in educational debt with interest accruing that would begin requiring payments as soon as Jake graduated. My parents hadn't just stolen opportunities from me. They'd created legal obligations that would follow me for decades. There's more, Uncle David continued. I checked with the law school's financial aid office. Jake's tuition is significantly higher than typical law students pay because he's not receiving any need-based aid. According to their records, his family's income and assets are too high for financial assistance. Too high based on what information, I asked. Based on tax returns that list your income as part of the household finances. Norton, they've been claiming you as a dependent while simultaneously using your credit and forged signatures to fund expenses you're not benefiting from. The systematic nature of the fraud was becoming clear. My parents had created a financial house of cards that depended on my identity, my credit, my supposed medical expenses, and my fabricated financial dependence. They'd been living beyond their means for years, using my name and extended family sympathy to bridge the gap between their income and their lifestyle. That evening, I called Jake directly for the first time since leaving home. He answered on the third ring, his voice sounding tired and stressed. Norton, I'm glad you called. Mom and Dad have been really upset since you left. They keep saying you're misunderstanding everything and that you'll come to your senses eventually. Jake, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers. Okay, he replied cautiously. Did you know that I'm listed as a co-signer on your law school loans? There was a long pause before Jake responded. What do you mean, co-signer? I mean that according to the loan documents, I'm legally responsible for $60,000 in educational debt if you default on payments. Norton, I never asked you to co-sign anything. I never even discussed my loans with you. Because our parents forged my signature on the loan documents, I explained. Jake, when you graduate and those loans go into repayment, I'll be legally obligated for the full amount unless I can prove fraud. Jake was quiet for nearly a minute before speaking again. Norton, I don't know what to say. I had no idea any of this was happening. They handled all the financial aid paperwork, and I just focused on studying. That's the problem, I replied. You've been focusing on studying while I've been working full-time jobs to support expenses that I didn't even know existed. Your education is being funded by fraud committed in my name. What do you want me to do? Jake asked, his voice cracking with emotion. I want you to take responsibility for your own financial obligations. Get copies of all your loan documents, financial aid paperwork, and educational expenses. Figure out what you actually owe and start making plans to pay for it yourself. Norton, I can't afford law school without help. If I have to pay for everything myself, I'll have to drop out. Then maybe you should consider whether law school is the right choice for you, I replied. Or maybe you should find legitimate ways to fund your education, like scholarships, work-study programs, or student jobs. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Jake had been protected from the financial realities of his educational choices, while I had been systematically exploited to make his protection possible. After ending the call, I sat in my small Seattle apartment, looking out at the city lights and reflecting on how dramatically my understanding of family dynamics had evolved. 3 weeks ago, I had believed that love meant sacrifice and that family members had the right to make unilateral decisions about each other's lives. Now I understood that healthy relationships required honesty, consent, and mutual respect. Love didn't justify fraud, and family connections didn't excuse criminal behavior. Tomorrow, I would begin the legal process of removing myself from Jake's educational obligations and holding my parents accountable for the full scope of their deception. Tonight, I would continue building the life I deserved, a life based on my actual efforts and legitimate opportunities. The scared, confused Norton who had fled home a month ago was gone. In his place was someone who understood his own worth and refused to accept exploitation disguised as family responsibility. Michelle Chang's law office had transformed into a war room over the past month. File cabinets overflowed with documentation of my parents' fraudulent activities. Bankers' boxes lined the walls containing evidence of forged signatures and falsified loan applications, and her desk was covered with correspondence from federal investigators who had taken interest in the case. Norton: I've seen identity theft cases before, but nothing quite this extensive. Michelle said, reviewing the latest findings from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Your parents created what amounts to a criminal enterprise using your identity as the foundation. The investigation had uncovered even more fraudulent activities beyond what Tyler and I had initially discovered. My social security number had been used to apply for credit at 17 different financial institutions over the past 4 years. Some applications were approved, others were denied, but all were submitted without my knowledge or consent. The pattern is clear. Michelle explained, pointing to a timeline she'd created showing the progression of fraudulent activities. Every time your parents faced a financial crisis, they used your identity to either obtain new credit or delay consequences for existing debt. I studied the timeline, noting how the frequency of fraudulent applications had increased after Jake started college. My identity had become their primary tool for bridging the gap between their income and their financial obligations. What's our strongest evidence for prosecution? I asked. The forged signatures on Jake's loan documents, Michelle replied immediately. We had a handwriting expert analyze them, and the report conclusively proves forgery, combined with the fact that you were never present when the loans were executed and never received copies of the paperwork. It's an airtight case for fraud. The handwriting analysis had been fascinating to witness. The expert, Dr. Patricia Williams, had spent 3 hours comparing the forged signatures to authentic samples of my handwriting. She'd identified consistent differences in letter formation, pen pressure, and signing rhythm that proved the loan signatures were created by someone attempting to imitate my natural handwriting patterns. The perpetrator was skilled at basic forgery. Dr. Williams had explained, but they couldn't replicate the unconscious muscle memory patterns that make each person's signature unique. These are definitely not authentic signatures. That afternoon, I received a call that changed the trajectory of the entire case. Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division wanted to meet with me in person to discuss expanding the investigation. Mr. Williams, we've reviewed the evidence your attorney provided, and we believe your parents' activities may be part of a larger pattern involving other families. We'd like your cooperation in a broader investigation. Agent Martinez was a sharp professional woman in her early 40s who specialized in family financial fraud cases. She explained that my parents' methods matched patterns they'd observed in other cases involving educational fraud and identity theft within families. The sophistication of the deception suggests experience, Agent Martinez said. People don't typically start with this level of organized fraud. They usually work up to it over time. She showed me case files of other families where similar patterns had emerged. Parents systematically exploiting one child's identity to fund another child's opportunities, elaborate deception, targeting extended family members, and forged loan documents for educational expenses. We suspect there may be other families in your community who have experienced similar fraud but haven't realized it yet. Your willingness to pursue prosecution has given us the evidence we need to investigate the broader network. The meeting was sobering because it revealed that my situation wasn't unique or isolated. Other families had been destroyed by similar patterns of manipulation and financial exploitation, but many victims had been too ashamed or intimidated to seek legal recourse. Meanwhile, my life in Seattle was flourishing in ways I'd never imagined possible. My work at Uncle David's firm had progressed from basic CAD training to contributing to real architectural projects. Jennifer had assigned me increasing responsibility, and I discovered a particular aptitude for problem-solving complex spatial challenges. "You have a gift for seeing solutions that others miss," Jennifer told me during my 3-month performance review. "I'm recommending you for our advanced training program, which typically takes new employees 18 months to qualify for." The University of Washington courses were equally rewarding. My mathematics professor had suggested I consider pursuing a full degree in architectural engineering, noting that my test scores placed me in the top 5% of continuing education students. "You'll find out, Mr. Williams, you're clearly capable of much more challenging academic work," Professor Janet Rodriguez said after class one evening. "Have you considered applying for our regular degree program with your academic background? You'd likely qualify for significant scholarship support." For the first time in my life, I was receiving encouragement based on demonstrated ability rather than family politics. People who had no emotional investment in my success were recognizing potential that my own family had systematically hidden from me. The contrast between my professional growth and my family's deteriorating situation was stark. Tyler had been keeping me updated on developments in Portland, and the news was increasingly dramatic. "Your parents are in serious financial trouble," Tyler reported during one of our weekly calls. "Dad heard they're 3 months behind on their mortgage, and the bank has started foreclosure proceedings." "What about the money they borrowed from family members?" I asked. "Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark are both demanding repayment now that they know the medical bills were fabricated. Your mom called my mom crying, saying they don't have the money to pay anyone back." The house of cards was collapsing as extended family members realized they'd been victims of fraud. My parents' comfortable middle-class lifestyle had been built on borrowed money and stolen credit, with my identity serving as the foundation for their deception. "And there's something else," Tyler continued. "Jake called me last week asking for advice about dropping out of law school. He said he can't concentrate on studying because he feels guilty about how his education was funded." "Good," I replied. "Guilt is appropriate in this situation. Maybe it'll motivate him to start making better choices." That week brought another significant development. Agent Martinez called to inform me that my parents had been formally charged with wire fraud, mail fraud, and identity theft federal crimes that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison. "They'll likely be offered a plea bargain," Agent Martinez explained. "But the charges are serious enough that they'll have to acknowledge their crimes and provide full restitution to all victims." The legal machinery was finally moving, but the personal cost was enormous. I would be testifying against my own parents in federal court, providing evidence that would likely result in their imprisonment. The scared, people-pleasing Norton from 6 months ago would have been devastated by this prospect. The person I'd become understood it as necessary justice. My parents made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. Dad called me on a Thursday evening, his voice shaking with emotion and desperation. "Norton, please. Your mother's having panic attacks and she can't sleep. This whole legal situation is destroying our family. Can't we work this out privately? You should have considered the family consequences before committing federal crimes," I replied calmly. "We never meant to hurt you," Dad continued. "Everything we did was trying to help both you boys succeed in life. We thought you were stronger and more self-sufficient so you could handle working while Jake focused on school. Dad, you stole my identity, forged my signature on loan documents, and lied to our extended family about fictional medical bills. None of that was designed to help me succeed. Norton, we're your parents. We love you. Doesn't that count for anything?" The question hung in the air, heavy with years of conditioning, that had taught me to confuse love with manipulation and family loyalty with self-sacrifice. Love doesn't excuse fraud, I replied. Love doesn't justify destroying someone's credit and stealing their opportunities. Love certainly doesn't mean I have to pretend this didn't happen to protect your feelings. Please. Dad's voice cracked completely. Jake's talking about dropping out of school. Your mother's talking about suicide. This is tearing our family apart. No, I said firmly. Your choices tore our family apart. I'm just refusing to pretend everything is normal anymore. After ending the call, I felt a complex mix of sadness and relief. The conversation confirmed that my parents still viewed themselves as victims of my unreasonable expectations, rather than perpetrators of systematic fraud. But it also proved that I'd developed the emotional strength to maintain appropriate boundaries, despite intense pressure and manipulation. The Norton who had absorbed blame and accepted responsibility for other people's problems was gone. In his place was someone who understood that healthy relationships required honesty, that love without respect was meaningless, and that protecting family members from consequences wasn't the same as caring about their well-being. The legal battle would continue for several more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. My parents would face consequences for their choices, I would be freed from fraudulent financial obligations, and my extended family would understand the truth about what had been happening. Most importantly, I was building a life based on my actual capabilities and legitimate opportunities. For the first time, my future was being determined by my own efforts rather than other people's limitations or deceptions. The scared, confused young man who had fled home believing he was a disappointment had transformed into someone with clear goals, strong boundaries, and genuine self-respect. The real work of building an authentic life was just beginning, but the foundation was finally solid. 6 months after leaving my parents' house on that devastating birthday night, I stood in federal court, watching Judge Patricia Morrison sentence my parents to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and full restitution to all victims. The courtroom was nearly empty except for essential personnel, Agent Martinez Michelle Chang, and Uncle David, who had driven up from Seattle to support me. My parents sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen them, finally facing consequences that couldn't be manipulated or explained away. What decree Dalthwalm? The court finds that the defendants engaged in systematic fraud over multiple years. Judge Morrison stated, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. The psychological and financial damage inflicted on the primary victim, their own son, represents a particularly egregious breach of parental responsibility and basic human decency. The judge's words provided validation I hadn't realized I needed. An objective legal authority had examined all the evidence and concluded that my parents' actions weren't misguided love or overprotective parenting. They were calculated crimes that had caused genuine harm. The defendants will serve their sentences at minimum security federal facilities. Judge Morrison continued. Upon release, they will be prohibited from accessing any financial accounts, credit applications, or legal documents belonging to the victim. They will also be required to attend family financial counseling and provide monthly financial reports to their probation officers. As my parents were led away in handcuffs, Dad turned to look at me one final time. His expression was a mixture of sadness and resignation, but not the remorse I'd hoped to see. Even facing prison time, he seemed to believe he was being punished for loving his children too much rather than for systematically betraying one child's trust. Outside the courthouse, Michelle handed me a thick folder containing documentation of my restored financial status. Every fraudulent debt had been removed from my credit report, every forged signature had been legally voided, and every stolen opportunity had been formally acknowledged. Your credit score is now 768, Michelle said with obvious satisfaction. That's higher than most people your age achieve legitimately. You're financially free to pursue any opportunities you choose. Agent Martinez joined us on the courthouse steps carrying her own folder of case materials. Norton, I want you to know that your willingness to pursue this case has led to investigations involving 12 other families in the Pacific Northwest. Your courage to speak up has helped other victims find justice. The broader impact of the case had been something I hadn't anticipated. My story had apparently encouraged other young adults to examine their own family financial situations more carefully, leading to discoveries of similar patterns of exploitation and fraud. We've identified a network of families where parents were systematically exploiting one child's identity to fund another child's opportunities. Agent Martinez explained, your case provided the template for recognizing and prosecuting this type of family financial abuse. That evening, Uncle David took me to dinner at a restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay. As we watched ferries navigate the dark water, he raised his wine glass in a toast. To Norton Williams, architect in training, crime victim turned prosecutor, and one of the bravest people I know. I don't feel particularly brave, I replied honestly. Most of the time, I feel like I'm just trying to figure out how to live normally after everything that happened. That's exactly what makes you brave, Uncle David responded. Courage isn't the absence of fear or confusion. Courage is choosing to do the right thing even when it's difficult and uncertain. The dinner conversation turned to my future plans, which were taking shape more clearly each week. My performance at the architecture firm had been strong enough to earn a permanent position with increasing responsibilities. The University of Washington had accepted me into their regular degree program with a partial scholarship that covered 60% of tuition costs. I've been thinking about what I want to specialize in, I told Uncle David. Jennifer suggested sustainable design and environmental architecture, creating buildings that help communities while minimizing environmental impact. That sounds perfect for someone who understands how systems can be used to help or harm people, Uncle David replied. You've experienced both sides of that equation. Over the past month, I'd also been developing a relationship with Jennifer's sister, Dr. Amanda Chen, who worked as a therapist, specializing in family trauma and financial abuse. Our conversations had helped me understand that healing from systematic manipulation was an ongoing process rather than a simple matter of achieving legal justice. Recovery from family financial abuse is similar to recovery from other forms of trauma, Amanda had explained during one of our coffee meetings. The trust violations run deep, and learning to trust your own judgment again takes time and practice. But the healing was definitely happening. I'd stopped second-guessing every decision, stopped assuming I was less capable than other people, and stopped accepting other people's limitations as facts about my potential. The following week brought news that completed my transformation from victim to survivor. Jake had dropped out of law school and was working at a restaurant in Portland, taking responsibility for his own financial obligations for the first time in his life. He's actually doing pretty well, Tyler reported during our weekly call. He got promoted to assistant manager after 6 weeks, and he's talking about maybe studying business or hospitality management. Apparently, he's good at organizing people and solving customer problems. The information was encouraging because it suggested Jake was discovering his own legitimate strengths rather than relying on opportunities stolen from others. His success felt clean and earned in a way that his previous achievements never had. What about the extended family situation? I asked. Everyone's been really supportive of you, Tyler replied. Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark both said they're proud of how you handled everything. Grandma Betty keeps saying she always knew you were the strong one, even though she never spoke up about the favoritism. The family relationships that had been built on authentic connection were surviving the crisis, while the relationships built on deception and manipulation had crumbled. It was a painful but necessary sorting process. That weekend, I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah Thompson, the guidance counselor, who had first helped me understand the scope of my parents' educational sabotage. Norton, I wanted to let you know that your story has become part of the training materials we use for recognizing family educational fraud, Sarah said. We've identified 6 other students whose college opportunities were systematically undermined by their families. She explained that my case had led to the development of new protocols for verifying student communications and detecting signs of family financial manipulation. Educational institutions were now better equipped to protect students from the type of systematic sabotage I'd experienced. You've helped create positive change that will protect other students for years to come, Sarah concluded. That's a pretty remarkable legacy. As autumn arrived in Seattle, I was settling into a routine that felt both challenging and sustainable. My days were filled with architectural projects that engaged my creativity and problem-solving abilities. My evenings involved either university coursework or time spent with Amanda, whose company provided intellectual stimulation and emotional support. The apartment Uncle David had provided was gradually becoming a real home, decorated with furniture I'd chosen, and books I was reading for pleasure, rather than just academic requirements. For the first time, my living space reflected my actual interests and personality, rather than other people's expectations about who I should be. One evening, while working on a technical drawing for a community center project, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of family success and personal worth had evolved over the past year. The Norton who had sat invisible at that birthday dinner 8 months ago had believed that love meant accepting whatever treatment family members chose to provide. He'd thought success was determined by other people's recognition, and that his worth depended on their approval. The person I'd become understood that love required mutual respect, that success was measured by personal growth and contribution to community, and that self-worth came from acting with integrity regardless of other people's responses. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Saw the news article about your parents' sentencing. How are you feeling about everything? I thought about his question carefully before responding, sad but free. It's painful to see them face consequences, but I finally feel like I can build a life based on truth instead of lies. Marcus replied immediately, you've changed so much since you crashed on my couch that night. You've become someone who stands up for himself and doesn't accept manipulation as normal. I'm proud of you. The validation from someone who had known me during my darkest period felt meaningful and earned. Marcus had watched me transform from a confused victim into someone capable of demanding honesty and pursuing opportunities. That night, as I looked out my window at the Seattle skyline, I thought about the young adults who might be experiencing similar manipulation and exploitation in their own families. The investigative work Agent Martinez had described suggested that family financial abuse was more common than most people realized, hidden by shame and family loyalty that protected perpetrators while silencing victims. I made a decision that felt both scary and necessary. I would begin speaking publicly about family financial abuse, sharing my story to help other victims recognize manipulation and find resources for recovery. The scared, apologetic Norton, who had absorbed blame and accepted limitations, was gone forever. In his place was someone who understood that sharing painful truths could prevent others from experiencing similar harm. My future was being built on legitimate opportunities, honest relationships, and authentic achievements. For the first time in my life, I was living as myself, rather than as someone else's project or disappointment. The real work of building a meaningful life was just beginning. But the foundation was solid, the vision was clear, and the person doing the building was finally worthy of the life he was creating. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, like your achievements didn't matter while others received all the recognition? How do you think you would handle discovering that family members had been systematically undermining your opportunities while presenting themselves as loving and supportive? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more real-life stories about overcoming family challenges and finding your authentic path. Sharing this video might help someone else recognize manipulation in their own family situation and find the courage to seek help. Thank you for taking this journey with me. And remember, your worth isn't determined by your family's recognition of your potential. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable harmful behavior even when it comes from people you care about. Until next time, keep building the life you deserve based on truth, respect, and your own authentic capabilities.